12 men had tried. 12 men had fallen. She didn't even try. She just walked toward him. Thornbury Park sat deep in the Sussex Downs, and in the autumn of 1818 its finest paddock held a problem the whole county had come to speak of, with a particular relish reserved for other men's misfortunes. A black stallion named Ajax, 16 hands of magnificent, murderous temper, who had thrown every rider the Duke of Thornbury had ever set upon him, 12 men in all across 2 full seasons, including, on one memorable and painful occasion, the Duke himself. Rhys Thornbury was 33, composed and commanding in every particular of his public life, tall and dark-eyed and possessed of the sort of unhurried authority that made grown men listen the moment he entered a room, and privately, where the horse was concerned, growing quietly desperate. Ajax had been his late father's last great purchase before his death 2 years before. A magnificent sire meant to found a new bloodline for the Thornbury stables, and the old Duke had died before ever breaking him properly, leaving Rhys a horse worth a small fortune and entirely unrideable, a standing joke among the county's horsemen, and, though Rhys would not have said so aloud to a living soul, a stubborn, painful symbol of a father's unfinished business he could not seem to finish either. That particular October afternoon, the 12th rider, a hard-handed breaker brought down specially from Newmarket at considerable expense, had just been thrown clear over the paddock rail in front of a small gathered audience of the Duke's guests, landing hard enough to need carrying off. And the whole party stood at the fence in various states of alarm and amusement, while Ajax wheeled and snorted and struck the churned earth with a foreleg, magnificent and entirely unmanageable, master of a paddock no man had yet proven he could share. It was into this scene of general commotion that a quiet young woman crossed the yard from the direction of the stables, unhurried, entirely unremarked by the gathered guests, who took her for a servant about some errand and gave her no more thought than they gave the gatepost. She had not been introduced to a single soul at Thornbury Park that autumn, because she had no standing among the guests to be introduced. Rosalind Fenn was 24, the late head groom's only daughter. Raised from infancy in the very stables, the great house's owners rarely troubled to enter themselves, and she had grown up alongside horses the way other girls grew up alongside sisters, with an unhurried, wordless understanding of them that the county's finest riding masters could not have taught in a lifetime of trying. She did not climb the paddock rail. She did not call out or approach with any particular caution at all, but simply walked toward the churned, dangerous center of that paddock the way she might have crossed her own kitchen, and the gathered guests, noticing her at last, drew breath in a collective alarmed hush, certain they were about to watch a foolish servant girl trampled in front of them. Ajax stopped. The great stallion, still snorting and wild-eyed from throwing his 12th rider, went suddenly, entirely still at Rosalind Fenn's approach, his ears coming forward rather than pinned flat, his great head lowering, of its own accord, to meet her outstretched hand, and the whole paddock, guests and grooms and the Duke of Thornbury himself, watched in a silence considerably more profound than the noise that had preceded it as a horse that had unseated a dozen skilled men in 2 full seasons simply walked forward, docile as a plough horse, and pressed his velvet nose into the palm of a woman no one at that gathering had thought to learn the name of. "Well," Rhys Thornbury said, into the astonished quiet, crossing to the rail himself, with an expression the narrator will describe honestly as something between disbelief and the beginning of a very particular kind of attention. "I confess I have paid 12 men a great deal of money this autumn to learn what that young woman appears to have known for free." Rosalind, aware suddenly of the whole gathered party's eyes upon her, flushed and made to step back, uncertain whether she had trespassed badly by walking uninvited into her employer's ruined afternoon. But Ajax, unwilling to let her go so easily, followed her step for step across the paddock, with his great head bowed near her shoulder, and the Duke of Thornbury, watching that improbable, gentle procession, found himself laughing outright for the first time in longer than he could easily recall. "Do not apologize," Reese said, when she reached the rail and stood there uncertain, the horse still crowding close behind her. "I have watched this animal nearly kill 12 men across 2 seasons, Miss Fenn, Your Grace," Rosalind said, dropping a hasty, flustered curtsy. "Rosalind Fenn, my father kept your stables until his death last spring. I did not mean to make a spectacle, Your Grace. I only came to fetch the bandaging for Mr. Hollis's arm, and the horse. He has always followed me since he was brought to us as a colt. I did not think to trouble the gathering." "You have not troubled it, Miss Fenn," Reese said. "You have solved, in the space of one unhurried walk across a paddock, a problem I have spent 2 years and a small fortune failing to solve myself. I find I am considerably more interested in how you managed it than in whatever mortification you imagine you have caused. It was, the narrator will tell you, the beginning of the most consequential conversation Rosalind Fenn had ever had with anyone above her own station, and neither of them yet understood how thoroughly it would rearrange the whole shape of the Thornbury estate. "He does not trust hands, Your Grace," Rosalind said, once the last of the guests had drifted off toward the house. Still discussing the astonishing scene with considerable animation, and she found herself alone at the paddock rail with the Duke himself for the first time. Not the way most horses learn to trust a familiar hand. "The trainer your father hired to break him, before he died. I do not like to speak ill of a man not here to answer for himself, Your Grace. But he used the whip a great deal more than the colt's temperament could bear, and Ajax has not forgotten a single stroke of it. He does not throw riders out of wickedness. He throws them because every man who has climbed onto his back since has reminded him, in some particular of grip or spur or voice, of the man who hurt him first." Reese was quiet a long moment, watching the great stallion stand calm now under her hands, where an hour before he had thrown a trained rider hard enough to break bone. "I remember the trainer," he said at last, low, something troubled crossing his composed face. "My father hired him on a recommendation from a friend at Newmarket, and dismissed his methods as none of a duke's proper concern so long as the horse was broken by spring. I was away at the time, finishing my own studies, and did not learn the particulars until I came home to find a colt gone wild-eyed and dangerous, and my father already too ill to trouble himself further with correcting it." His jaw tightened. "I have often wondered whether the horse's ruin and my father's own final decline were more connected than either of us ever admitted. A man too proud to reverse a bad decision, watching the consequence of it grow worse by the month and calling his own stubbornness patience instead." "I did not know your father well, Your Grace," Rosalind said carefully, "but my own father spoke of him kindly enough. When he spoke of him at all, he said the old Duke was a proud man who found it easier to purchase a solution than to sit with a problem long enough to understand it properly. I do not say that unkindly. I have met a great many men of standing who share the same trouble, and a great many who never learn to correct it. And do you believe I share it?" Reese asked, and there was real curiosity in the question, not offense. "I believe you rode out to that paddock yourself, Your Grace, and took your own fall trying to fix what your father left broken, rather than simply selling the horse and calling the loss done," Rosalind said. "That is not the same trouble at all. That is a man willing to sit with the problem, even when it throws him. And you," Reese said, watching her closely, "remind him of nothing of the sort." "I have never once raised a hand to him in anger, Your Grace, nor to any horse in my care," Rosalind said simply. "He knows the difference. Horses generally do, given time enough to learn it." Before the last of the autumn light left the paddock that day, Reese Thornbury had made Rosalind Fenn an offer she had not expected, and did not entirely know how to receive. That she come to the stables each day not as a groom's daughter doing occasional errands, but as the horse's proper and paid handler, with the standing and the wage such a post deserved, whatever the county's opinion of a woman holding it. Rosalind had hesitated at first, uncertain what such a public arrangement might cost her in a county quick to gossip over any woman given unusual standing. But her father's own memory decided the matter in the end, for she could not, she told herself, honor a lifetime spent teaching her that a horse deserved patient, honest handling above all else, and then refuse the one post in England that would let her practice it properly. If a story of a wound finally trusted to heal, horse and man both, is the kind that keeps you listening, stay. What grew between the paddock and the house over the weeks that followed changed the whole of Thornbury Park. Rosalind came to the stables each morning after that and worked with Ajax in the quiet hour before the household woke, and it was in that same quiet hour, more mornings than either of them planned, that Rhys Thornbury began finding reasons of his own to be in the stable yard. Checking accounts that did not truly need checking, inspecting tack that was already sound, simply, in the end, to watch a patient woman undo, one unhurried morning at a time, the damage a cruel man's whip had left in a frightened animal's memory. You talk to him as though he understands every word, Rhys said one such morning, leaning on the stall door while Rosalind worked a soft brush along Ajax's flank in long, even strokes. He does not understand the words, Your Grace, Rosalind said, not pausing in her work. He understands the voice that carries them, steady, unhurried, never raised. That is the whole of the lesson, I think, for horses and for people both, though I have found people considerably slower to learn it. You include dukes in that assessment, I take it, Rhys said, with the ghost of a smile. I include dukes especially, Your Grace, Rosalind said. And there was, for the first time, a dry humour in it that made Rhys Thornbury laugh outright a second time in a fortnight he had not expected to laugh in at all. It was some weeks into that quiet daily arrangement that Rosalind told him, in the unhurried privacy of the stable's early light, of the small blue ribbon she kept always plaited into Ajax's halter, frayed now, faded from years of weather, tied there the same way, she explained, that her own mother had once tied an identical ribbon round Rosalind's own small wrist as a girl, the last such comfort her mother had given her before dying of a fever the winter Rosalind turned. 9. I do not know that it does the horse any true good, Rosalind admitted, working the worn ribbon gently through her fingers, beyond the plain fact that I believe it does, and horses read a handler's own steadiness a great deal more closely than her superstitions. But I have never once worked with Ajax, from the first week he came to us as a frightened colt, without it plaited into his halter. And I confess I have grown unwilling to test whether the habit truly matters, or whether I simply cannot bear to work without a piece of my mother somewhere close at hand. I do not think that is superstition, Miss Fenn, Rhys said. Quiet. I think that is exactly the kind of steadiness a wounded creature learns to trust, whether it comes from a ribbon or from the woman wearing it. I find I have begun to trust it myself, watching you these past weeks, rather more than I trusted any of the 12 hard-handed men I paid a fortune to fail before you. He had not meant to say it so plainly, and something in his own admission seemed to catch him by surprise as much as it caught her, for he fell quiet a moment after, watching her hands move steady and sure along the horse's flank. And Rosalind, feeling the weight of his attention settle on her in a way it had not quite done before, found her own hands slowing at their work despite herself. There came a grey morning some weeks after that, Miss still lying low over the paddocks, when Rhys arrived at the stable earlier than his usual hour and found Rosalind already there, kneeling in the straw beside Ajax's foreleg, working a poultice into a small strain the horse had taken the day before. She did not hear him come in over the horse's own quiet shifting, and he stood a long moment in the doorway simply watching her work, the careful, unhurried competence of her hands, the low murmur of her voice as she talked the horse through the discomfort of the poultice, a stray lock of hair come loose from her cap and fallen across her cheek that she had not troubled to push back. "You work as though no one is watching," Reese said at last, and she startled. Glancing up, colour rising in her face at having been observed so closely and for so long without her knowledge. "I did not hear you, Your Grace," she said, rising, brushing straw from her skirts with hands that were not quite steady now, though the horse beside her had gone perfectly calm under her care only a moment before. "I did not mean to startle you," Reese said, and crossed the stall to stand nearer than strict propriety generally allowed between a duke and his groom's daughter, close enough that Rosalind could see the fine lines of tiredness at the corners of his eyes, close enough that neither of them, for a long-charged moment, seemed entirely certain what ought to happen next. His hand rose, almost, toward the loose curl at her cheek, and hers lifted, uncertain, neither quite reaching to stop him, nor quite inviting him further, the whole quiet stable holding its breath around the narrowing distance between them. It would have taken nothing at all to close it. Reese felt the whole weight of what he was not permitted to want pressing against the whole weight of how badly. In that grey silent moment, he wanted it anyway, a duke and a groom's daughter, a gap the world would call unbridgeable, and yet neither of them stepped back. It was Ajax himself, shifting his great weight and blowing out a long, unimpressed breath through his nose, who broke the moment before either of them could, and both of them laughed, unsteady. Grateful for the interruption and faintly disappointed by it in equal measure. "He does not care for being kept waiting," Rosalind said, breathless, busying her hands with the poultice wrap again. "No," Reese agreed, stepping back at last, though it cost him visibly to do it. "I find I am beginning to understand the feeling rather well myself." It was into this careful, growing understanding that Sir Rowland Ashby rode one bright November morning, and the whole tenor of the autumn changed with him. Sir Rowland was a prosperous, ambitious baronet whose own stud farm bordered Thornbury land to the east, and he had watched the story of the Duke's unrideable stallion travel through the county's horse breeding circles with an interest considerably sharper than idle curiosity, for Ajax's bloodline, properly established, was worth a fortune in stud fees to whichever house could prove the animal. Manageable, and Sir Rowland had spent 2 years quietly hoping the Duke would tire of a useless, dangerous horse and sell him cheap. The news that a groom's daughter had somehow tamed the beast without Sir Rowland's own considerable resources being brought to bear at all struck him as both an affront to his own standing among the county's horsemen and, more practically, a serious threat to the advantageous purchase he had been patiently waiting to make. "I hear remarkable things, Your Grace," Sir Rowland said, over the Duke's own dinner table, to which he had contrived an invitation through mutual acquaintance, a stable girl with a gift for gentling the unrideable. "I confess I find such tales generally owe more to fortunate coincidence than to any true skill. And I wonder whether Your Grace has considered that a horse so valuable deserves a more established hand than a groom's untrained daughter, however charming her way with animals may prove in a paddock." "Miss Fenn's skill is not charm, Sir Rowland," Reese said, an edge entering his usually even voice. "I have watched 12 trained men fail where she succeeded within the hour, and I do not find coincidence a satisfying explanation for that particular arithmetic." "Then perhaps Your Grace would permit a public test of the matter," Sir Rowland said, smooth and reasonable on its surface, "at the county's autumn exhibition next fortnight. Let Miss Fenn demonstrate her gift before proper witnesses, and I shall be the first to concede my doubt, whatever the outcome. It seems only fair, given the sums such a bloodline commands, that the county satisfy itself the animal is truly manageable and not merely obedient to one particular hand, in circumstances too convenient to trust." It was, on its face, a reasonable request, and Reese, seeing no honest way to refuse it without appearing to protect a claim he did not himself doubt, agreed, not yet understanding that Sir Rowland Ashby had no intention of losing that wager honestly. The fortnight before the exhibition passed in a particular anxious quiet at Thornbury Park, for Rosalind had never yet ridden Ajax before a crowd. Only worked him from the ground in the private calm of the stable yard, and she spent every spare hour of those 2 weeks building, patiently, the trust that mounting him properly would require, first simply leaning her weight across his back while he stood calm in the paddock, then sitting astride for a few careful minutes at a time. Always with the frayed blue ribbon close at hand, and always with Rhys watching from the rail, offering nothing but his own quiet, steady presence, having learned by then exactly what value that particular kind of steadiness carried. "You are afraid," Rhys said, the evening before the exhibition, finding her still in the stable long after the household had gone in to supper. Running a comb through Ajax's mane with hands that betrayed, for the first time since Rhys had known her, something less than her usual composure. "I am afraid of failing him in front of half the county, Your Grace," Rosalind admitted. "Not of falling myself. I have fallen from worse horses than this one, and thought nothing of the bruises. I am afraid that if I fail before witnesses, the county will decide the whole 2 years' work was luck after all, and Sir Rowland will have his excuse to press you towards selling him regardless." "Then we shall simply have to not fail," Rhys said, and there was a quiet certainty in it that steadied her more than any grander reassurance could have. "I have watched you undo 2 years of another man's cruelty with nothing but patience and a length of ribbon, Rosalind. I do not believe a crowd of gawking neighbours is the harder test." The county's autumn exhibition drew a considerable crowd the following day. The whole of Sussex's horse-breeding society gathered at the showground beneath a bright, cold sky to watch. Carriages lined 3 deep along the field's edge, and the air thick, with the particular festive murmur of a county eager to be entertained by someone else's risk. Rosalind Fenn walked Ajax into the exhibition ring before several hundred watching eyes, with the same unhurried calm she brought to every ordinary morning in the Thornbury stables. The frayed blue ribbon plaited fresh into his halter that morning, her own hands steady despite the crowd's weight of attention pressing in on every side, and it was in the middle of that calm, careful demonstration, with Rosalind mounted at last upon the great stallion's back for the first time, before a watching crowd, walking him through a slow, controlled circuit of the ring to a scattering of astonished applause, that a sharp, sudden crack sounded from the crowd's edge, close enough to startle even a well-settled horse into panic. It was no accident. Sir Rowland's own groom, paid well and instructed carefully, had set off a small firework device at precisely the moment calculated to do the most damage to the demonstration's calm. And Ajax, startled violently by the sudden noise, reared hard enough to nearly unseat Rosalind entirely, his great hooves striking dangerously close to the ring's crowded rail as the frightened crowd scattered and screamed. Rosalind did not fall. She held her seat through the rear by instinct alone, and in the same instant reached down and closed her hand around the frayed blue ribbon still plaited into Ajax's halter, and began, low and steady even as the crowd's panic swelled around them, the same unhurried voice she had used every morning for 2 years to talk a frightened colt back from the edge of his own fear. "Easy," she said, over and over, quiet and unbroken, her hand steady on the ribbon, her seat steady on his back despite the danger. "Easy, now, I am here. I am here." The great horse, still trembling, found the thread of that familiar steadiness through his own fright, and came down at last from the rear, and stood, shaking but controlled, in the centre of a ring gone otherwise to chaos. And it was Rhys Thornbury, vaulting the rail himself the instant the danger showed, who reached them first, catching the bridle with one hand and Rosalind's own trembling hand with the other, before either of them fully understood that the crisis had passed. The chaos that followed lasted only a handful of frightened minutes, though it felt to Rosalind. still seated and still murmuring her steady litany into Ajax's twitching ear, considerably longer, the crowd's screams settling by degrees into an anxious, watchful hush, other horses along the rail whinnying and stamping in sympathetic alarm, grooms running to calm what animals they could while every eye in the field remained fixed on the great black stallion and the woman who had somehow kept her seat through the whole terrifying business. It did not take the crowd long, once the immediate danger had passed, to trace the fireworks' origin back to Sir Rowland's own groom, caught fleeing the scene by two quick-thinking stable hands, who had marked him lingering suspiciously near the rail before the demonstration began. And the baronet's careful reasonableness collapsed entirely under the weight of his own scheme exposed before several hundred witnesses. "You very nearly had her killed," Rhys said, crossing the ring to where Sir Rowland stood white-faced amid the crowd's gathering fury. "Over a stud fee, Ashby. I do not care to imagine what you believed the sums were worth. But I promise you they were not worth what you very nearly cost this county's finest horsewoman today." His voice carried the whole ring's attention now, hard and absolute, and more than one gathered breeder nodded grim agreement. For a scheme that endangered a woman's life over a matter of bloodstock offended even those among the crowd who cared for little beyond their own stable's profit. "You will not set foot on Thornbury land again, and I will make certain every breeder from here to Newmarket understands precisely why, so that whatever standing you imagined this scheme would win you is spent instead on the opposite. A man who cannot win honestly does not deserve to win at all, Ashby, and I find the whole of this county is inclined, today, to agree with me." Sir Rowland Ashby left the exhibition ground in a disgrace so thorough and so public that his own stud farm's reputation never fully recovered from the telling of it, and the county's horse-breeding society, which had gathered that day half expecting to watch a stable girl humiliated, instead carried home the far better story of a groom's daughter who had held her seat through a deliberate act of sabotage and talked a panicked stallion back to calm with nothing but her own steady voice and a length of frayed ribbon. Rhys Thornbury did not let go of her hand once the danger had passed, and Rosalind, still trembling from the rear and the noise and the whole terrifying arithmetic of what might have happened, did not draw it back. "I have watched you gentle the most dangerous animal on my whole estate for 2 years, Miss Fenn," Rhys said, low, for her hearing alone amid the dispersing crowd, "and I find I have been considerably slower to notice the plainest truth of the whole arrangement, that I have fallen entirely in love with the woman doing the gentling, and very nearly lost the chance to say so today, over a fool's stud fee." His grip on her hand tightened. "Careful. I do not care what the county makes of a duke who loves his own groom's daughter. I have watched enough men fail at things that mattered to know exactly what it costs a man to keep silent about the one thing that finally does not fail him. Marry me, Rosalind, not for the horse and not for the rescue today, but because you have spent 2 years teaching me, one quiet morning at a time, exactly what steadiness is worth, and I find I have no wish to spend a single further morning learning it from anyone else." The kiss she gave him then, in the settling dust of the exhibition ring, with Ajax's warm breath still stirring the hair at her neck, was quiet and certain, and what broke open in Rosalind was the plain astonishment of being chosen, not despite her low standing, but for the whole plain competence that standing had never once diminished. The county, which had gathered at the exhibition half expecting to watch a stable girl humiliated, and had instead watched her hold her seat through a deliberate act of sabotage, spent the following weeks thoroughly revising its opinion of Rosalind Fenn, and revised it further still when word spread of the Duke's intention to marry her. For a scandal that might once have consumed a lesser story was instead absorbed, by slow county degrees, into an altogether more flattering tale of a Duke wise enough to recognize genuine worth when the whole of Sussex had spent 2 years overlooking it entirely. They were married the following spring at Thornbury Park, with the whole stable staff standing witness alongside the county's finest families, and Ajax himself, thoroughly settled by then under Rosalind's daily care, was led into the churchyard by a young stable boy to stand, astonishingly docile, at the edge of the gathered crowd, for Rosalind had declared, only half in jest, that the horse who had first brought them together deserved to see the wedding through to its proper end. More than one guest that day remarked, quietly, that they had never in their lives seen a duke look so plainly and unguardedly happy, nor seen a stallion of such famous temper stand so calm through an afternoon of church bells and cheering, and the two facts, the county generally agreed, were not entirely unconnected. So Roland Ashby's own stud farm never recovered its former standing. Breeders who had once sent him their finest mares took their custom elsewhere, unwilling to be associated with a man who had nearly gotten a woman trampled over a stud fee, and he sold the property within 3 years and removed himself to a distant county where his reputation had not yet travelled ahead of him, a quieter and considerably more thorough ruin than any single dramatic punishment could have arranged. Ajax sired, in the years that followed, exactly the bloodline the old duke had once hoped to found, though the horses that came of him carried a gentler temperament than their sire's own troubled youth had ever suggested was possible. For Rosalind bred him, in time, only to mares she herself had chosen and gentled by the same patient methods that had first calmed him, and the Thornbury stables became known, across 2 counties, not merely for the quality of their bloodstock, but for a particular steadiness of temperament no other stable in Sussex could quite reproduce. A reputation Rosalind herself judged the truer inheritance of her own father's quiet lives. Work. The frayed blue ribbon stayed plaited into Ajax's halter every day of his long and finally peaceful life, and when Rosalind and Rice's first daughter was born the following winter, Rosalind tied a fresh ribbon of the same worn blue round the infant's small wrist on her very first morning, the same unbroken thread of steadiness passed down now 3 generations deep, from a dying mother to a grieving girl, from a grieving girl to a wounded horse, and from a wounded horse's own hard-won calm to a small sleeping daughter who would grow up, in her turn, learning exactly what her mother had always known, that the truest gentling in this world is never done with force, but with the plain, patient, unhurried gift of being trusted to stay. Rhys, for his part, took to spending his own quiet mornings in the stable yard long after any practical need for it remained, watching his wife work with the same unhurried devotion that had first undone him 2 autumns before, and told anyone who asked that he had learned more about being a good duke and a good husband from 12 failed rides and 1 patient groom's daughter than from any tutor his own father had ever hired him.